but good evening. It's Thursday. That means it's Evenings with Artifacts. I'm Heather Nickerson, co-founder and CEO. Tonight, I am joined by Sarah Reeder. She is the founder and CEO of Artifactual History. We are super excited to have her with us to talk all things silver. So a bit about Sarah before we jump into the questions. She's a certified member of the Appraisers Association of America and a certified member of the International Society of Appraisers. She received her appraisal training at New York University's program in appraisal studies in fine and decorative arts, and her master's and undergraduate degrees from the College of William and Mary. In her role as CEO of Artifactual History, Sarah prepares appraisal reports of fine art, silver, furniture, ceramics, antiques, and decorative arts for insurance coverage, estate purposes, and other intended uses. Sarah is a silver specialist and creator of the self-paced online course Silver 101. Quickly learn how to identify your sterling silver and silver plate to find the valuable pieces and sort with empowered confidence. And I will say firsthand, I took the course and I learned so much. I will pop that link into the chat box in a moment so you all can have that as a reference. But without further ado, very pleased to welcome Sarah Reeder to our Evenings with Artifacts. And Sarah, before we get started and dive into the ins and outs of silver, could you please tell us a bit more about yourself, what led you to where you are today, and what is it like being a fellow female founder and running your own company?
Thank you, Heather. It's such an honor to be here tonight. Thank you so much. I'm excited to talk all about silver, and I love this question, and particularly when it's asked by a fellow female founder. That's really hard to say because I think it's so important to talk about women in business, because there are a lot of us, and the more we talk about it, the more we can give examples for people out there who might feel aligned for that, and that it can be done, and it's really, really fun. So I started my business in the beginning of 2016 after many years working for other people in the auction world and the museum world. And it is such a great fit for me being an entrepreneur. I love the creativity of what I do, in that as an entrepreneur and a founder, you literally are inventing this from nothing and making decisions in the moment and just a lot of figuring it out. And so it's very creatively stimulating and problem solving. And it's been really one of the best choices I've ever made. And I'm so impressed with the company that you and Ellen have built. So I really respect you both as female founders too. In terms of the development of my business, I started just being an appraiser, art and antique appraisals, and silver, of course. And because I'm a very creative person, I quickly realized that there were many different facets to the work that I do that I wanted to include in the kind of my overall corporate umbrella. So when the pandemic hit and I couldn't go out and be with people and explain how to tell whether they had sterling silver or silver plate at their kitchen table, I decided to make an online course, the one you mentioned, which thank you so much. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it and it was helpful for you, because that was the closest I could get under those conditions to being in somebody's home, explaining that to them. And so that was surprisingly really challenging to translate everything that I did in person into the online format, but a really fun challenge. And then I, 4 years ago, started a magazine with my good friend, Courtney Alston Christie, who's an appraiser in Georgia, that is called Worthwhile Magazine. And that's free, totally free, and with the goal of making information available to people about art and antiques. So our whole archive of articles is free online at worthwhilemagazine.com if you want to check it out. And I have a couple other collaborations I work on too, in addition to my main appraisal business. I'm part of the team for Toad Archive, which I didn't invent, but it's a genius concept. My friends Alex and Vanessa Wendell in Germany have conceptualized and created that, and it's an archive for mid-century modern design. So I'm one of their researchers on their team. And then also, just brand new, I am launching an online membership with my good friend Larissa Wild for art collecting, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So stay tuned for details about that, the Art Elevator Art Collectors Club. And yeah, it's been a wonderful journey and led to a lot of fun opportunities like this, where I get to share my knowledge with people so that hopefully it can help them enjoy the objects they live with on an even deeper level.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing, Sarah. Listening to you talk about all that reminds me of one thing I heard a while back, that as an entrepreneur, you have the luxury of working any 16 hours in a day that you choose. And I
or more.
Yeah, or more. That is so true. So having said that, let's jump right into the wonderful world of silver. So I've recently learned, thanks to you, that silver has a fascinating history across the Americas, Britain, France, and Russia. Could you tell us a bit about the history of silver and how it became such a sought after tabletop accessory?
Sure. Silver has a really fascinating history, and it actually goes back a lot farther than one might think. The earliest found so far examples of silver that was worked by humans, they go back about 5,000 years to ancient Anatolia, which is now the region of modern day Turkey. And that is so far where archaeologists have found the first evidence of silver. And so silver was very sought after in the ancient world, used in coins, of course, and a lot of church items, and really for what we think about in silver in modern times, one of the big things where the Americas had a huge amount of natural silver and silver mining, and it actually ended up being a huge incentive for the European colonizing forces to seize the indigenous lands because they wanted to get more sources for silver because the silver items were so sought after in the European economies. So that was actually a huge impact on Western civilization as we know it in the last 1,000 years, and led to a lot of bad things happening too. But in terms of what we think of as modern day silver and silver on the table, that's really more in the last 300 or 400 years. And there was this total explosion in the concept of household, material culture and people having personal possessions, which that's kind of a strange thing in our modern times when we have so many items. Whereas if you look at a household inventory, probate inventory from 300 years ago, and it was the wealthiest person in the town, their entire worldly goods might total a page, so it's the object density of our lives has changed a lot, but the silver flatware and tablewares, it's become a part of that. So having a way to show status, kind of the keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon, was increasingly important in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And having silver for the table was a way that people could show their guests, people who were coming to their home, that they had the resources to have these items display their status, kind of show their wealth. And also at the same time, along with this, dining rituals were becoming increasingly elaborate and sort of this performative way of interacting with one's peers. And I have to give a shout out to my university professor, Barbara Carson, who sadly passed away a long time ago, but she had a profound impact in terms of how I think about material culture and tablewares in particular. She was the author of the book Ambitious Appetites, which chronicled this in federal Washington. And so all of these, like the Victorian implements that we think of and we think, what is this? What, asparagus tongs? What did you use this lemon fork for? All of these implements had a really particular function in the tablescape setting of the 19th century that everyone would have understood. And it was kind of this unspoken language of how they interacted and demonstrated their place in the world. So it became a phenomenon that, strangely enough, with the advent of dishwashers in the 20th century, has really weakened. And so we're at this unusual place now where we're almost the archaeologists of these beautiful items trying to figure out, what do I do with them? That's always the question. What do I do with this? And so part of what I'm hoping I can shed some light on tonight is, brainstorm with some suggestions I found through my work with clients of really cool things that people can do with their silver that, is practical for our daily lives, but also is a great way to incorporate beloved things of your ancestors into how you live your life.
That's a great transition, Sarah, to the next question. I do want to note, though, for our audience members, we've got a bunch of questions for Sarah tonight, but if you have others too, please pop them in the chat. We're always welcoming of your questions, and we'll make sure we have time today to cover them as well. So up next, I'm really curious, what do you typically see or find when you're working with clients and their silver collections?
It's really fascinating because it ends up being a portrait of the history of the family. So I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area, where we have a really vibrant international community, a lot of people who have family members and ancestors who were in the military or in the diplomatic service. And so it leads to a really fascinating mix of local silver collections where people might have been, the ancestor was a general in the military, and so they had to entertain huge amounts of people as part of that culture. And so they might have a flatware service for 24 rather than the normal 12 or 8 that you typically encounter when you're not having to entertain, huge numbers of people. And people might have silver from a country of origin if they weren't originally from America, or their ancestors weren't originally from America. And so I typically find there's at least one flatware service. Sometimes there are, 4 or 5 flatware services where people have been the recipient of kind of the whole family tree. It all comes down to the person who's interested in the silver. So it might be this grandparent's silver service, this grandparent's silver service. And something that's really evocative about silver is that often is tied to a moment in time, like a wedding, like, oh, this was the silver service my mother got when she was married, or this was the trophy cup that my grandfather won in this boating race. And so, and often it's very personal with monograms or, inscriptions, 25-year anniversary presents. That was a big thing I see for Victorian silver in particular. And so if you can decode the why of why something was given, then it can really add a lot of depth to the story, and then it can be artifacted.
Yes, I can. I just popped a link into chat that shows the audience some of our artifacts people have created other different silver pieces or silver collections. It's amazing how versatile silver is and where you find it in your home, sometimes without even realizing it. I want to go back a little bit and elaborate something that I've heard you say before, and I think you alluded to in that kind of overview of what you see in collections. But I've heard you say that depending on where you're located, you may have different types of silver. Could you explain that a bit to the audience?
Sure. There are, for example, in the South, there's a different tradition of using silver for entertaining. And so I often find if someone is from a Southern family, they have a lot more silver than if someone is not from a Southern family, just generally speaking. And for example, if someone, their ancestors were based in the New Orleans area, they might have more silver by a French maker because they might have ancestors who are French origin. And so it's really interesting because you can kind of trail the in New England, you might have more English silver with people who have closer ties to England. It's almost a history of the last 200 years and how people moved around and the mixture of cultures. And so there are certain types of silver that are more heavily concentrated in certain areas, like French silver in the Gulf South and New Orleans.
Great. Thank you so much for explaining that a bit more. When you approach appraising a collection, how do you start? How do you approach it? Are there any tips for at-home audience if they're looking at a pile of silver in their cupboard or in their pantry and they're just curious, like, even what is it? Like, where do you start, and where would you suggest our audience starts too?
Great question. And I will back up one step for the big picture, and that there are many different types of value. So when I appraise, it's set at a very specific moment in time, which is the effective date, and then a very specific type of value, which is set in its own market. So there is no one value for anything. And of course, in my personal opinion, the heart value is the most important. And so that's something that comes up a lot in terms of items that have really, really significant heart value in terms of being beloved, having a lot of personal meaning to someone. And that may be correlated, there may be a pretty equal monetary value or maybe not. But I always, in my work, I try to be very sensitive and respectful to that. And that I don't view that the heart value is any less important than the monetary value. In fact, honestly, personally, for me, I think it's the more important of the values. But I wanted to kind of preface that when I say value, I'm not talking about one amorphous, always applicable value. It's like for insurance appraisals, it's retail replacement value, which is if you go into a retail silver dealer, which is going to be a lot of money probably. But if you are buying something at auction, it will be less money most generally. So if you're at a estate sale, it's going to be probably even less money. And so there different levels of the market that, depending on what situation one's approaching, that's going to be tied to. Like for an estate appraisal, I won't use retail replacement value. I'll be using fair market value, which is lower. And so that's something that unless you do what I do for a living, it's really hard to understand. And so I wanted to, before I dive into the question, I wanted to explain that because it's really important context for the next part, which is when I'm doing an appraisal, first, of course, it depends on the intended use, and is it something that if it's for insurance, the first thing I'll do is kind of try to scan, do they need an insurance appraisal? Is it a collection that has a lot of heart value, but maybe not so much monetary value? They probably don't need to pay me to do an appraisal in that instance, and I'll communicate that to them. If for legal reasons they need an estate appraisal, well then, it doesn't really matter the value, they just need it. And so that will be the research as the effective date for the fair market value. So there are different, usually it's very specific to the context of needs. And so there's all this work I do before I begin the work. It sounds like running a business, right? That'll be familiar to you. And then it's helping the client understand why all of these contextual elements are important. And then sometimes when people just want to know, they may not need an appraisal at all. And that's part of why I created the online course. And there are a lot of great resources online as well. But the first thing I would recommend for people who are at home and they have a big pile of silver and they're like, what is all this stuff? Is it heart value? Is it more than heart value? The first thing I would recommend is sort and see if you can identify between the items that are sterling silver and the items that are silver plate, because that is going to be a great step to help get you more information about what you have.
And Sarah, how do you do that exactly? Like, is there a telltale sign or marking? Like if I'm just looking at, I've got this drawer, and this may actually be very true in my case, I've got this drawer and I don't know what's what. Like where do you start?
The US government did this great thing in 1906 where they made it legally required that if something was sterling, it had to say sterling on it. So the first thing you do is you pick up the item and you look at it and you say, does it say sterling on it? So if it does, you're good to go. Like that is, you already, that's half the battle. If it doesn't, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have more research to do. So silver plate sometimes isn't marked. It has a lot of other names. It's marked with EPNS, A1, a name of a maker, which was a known silver plate maker who never made sterling, that sort of thing. If it says sterling, and it's made in the 20th century, you are pretty much in good shape. But there are other countries have their own markings, and then before 1906, marking in America was very haphazard. So it gets a little more complicated. Sometimes it's useful to call somebody like me, but that is the other thing I like before I go to the markings, which is really the definitive way of telling, is sometimes it's overwhelming when you just have, the pile. I've seen the piles before. I like to look at the color. That's as I'm across the room judging, like how much of this is sterling, how much of this is silver plate, which of course I check with the marks. But the really beautifully, colorfully tarnished silver items that, they have fuchsia, they have gold, they have teal when it holds up to the light. They generally are the silver plated items. The prettier the tarnish, the higher the chance it's silver plate, because all those beautiful colors are the other metals in the alloy that are reacting. Might have copper, the alloys can differ. So, but sterling silver, which is 925 parts out of 1,000 silver, because 1,000 out of 1,000 silver is very, very soft. So it's not used to make objects generally. Sterling tarnish is, generally speaking, a really dull matte gray. And so, like how people basically decorate their houses now, if it looks like a real estate ad, it's probably tarnished sterling. But I've seen exceptions to this depending on how something was stored. Like if sterling was wrapped in newspaper, it might have beautiful tarnish. So it's not 100%. But when I'm just eyeing a pile and thinking, okay, how much of this is silver plate, that generally is a pretty good way to get a very rough estimate. And then I dive in and I start looking for the marks.
Mm-hmm. That's a great first tip. And that would definitely, I think, help a lot of us. You open the cupboard and you're just like, there's a rainbow of color sometimes, or other times this is very dull, gray, tarnished piece of silver. And so,
and the touch too, actually. Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
Generally speaking, and of course, all these are, there are exceptions, so it's not 100%, but generally speaking, sterling silver is buttery, it's warm, it's fairly lightweight in your hands. It kind of has a different density than silver plated items. Silver plated items are slick, they're cold. If you run your thumb across it, you don't have a sense of buttery. It's just kind of this slick coldness. And so there's the touch test too. Again, there are exceptions, but when I dive in there and I'm looking at color and I'm feeling things, that's what I'm doing in my brain.
That's great to know. Um, Thinking about like specific, you mentioned earlier specific markings that some different brands make different markings. Are there any specific like telltale signs or telltale markings that you have on your hands a like significant monetarily valuable collection, not just that heart value? Because I'm with you, I'm all about the heart value. I love the heart value and stories of objects. But what about that? Like, how do you is there a way for you to know kind of at first glance, oh, this has monetary value as well based on markings or those telltale signs?
Well, I like to joke that you can never go wrong with Tiffany. So if you have a silver piece that's made by Tiffany and Company, that is generally speaking going to do better in the market than a piece that was made by one of their contemporary competitors, because people, they love Tiffany, and so it holds that brand value, just kind of like fashion, with Chanel, things. It's something that people trust in the legacy of that brand. So if you have a whole cupboard of Tiffany sterling silver, congratulations, you've got heart value and monetary value. But there are a lot of names that are significant American makers that generally do quite well. Like Gorham is a maker that I encounter a lot in my area, because it was a very, very popular 20th century maker. And then some of the makers' names are harder they're pictorial marks. They don't always make it easy and, spell the name out on the handle. Like Dominic and Half has a geometric mark, and this is where people like us come in. Sometimes I have a huge book I use to look up some of those marks. And often, once you've been doing it for years, you just go, oh, that's Dominic and Half. So, but there are websites online too, like 925outof1000.com is a great website for trying to identify marks. So there's a lot out there to help people. And, anyone here, always don't hesitate to call me. I'm happy to talk with you and give you some pointers.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. We've got a question from one of our audience members. Matt would like to know, is there just silver, or is all quote unquote real silver called sterling silver?
Oh, that's such a great question. It's as with so many things with silver, it's complicated. So there are lots of different types of silver. The most common one is the 925 out of 1000, which is sterling. But there's also Britannia silver, which is higher, and that is used sometimes in yes, thank you for posting that. That's a great website. Britannia silver is a higher silver content that is, as you might guess from the name, used in England. Then a lot of German silver is 800 out of 1000. And so that is, the general fineness in Germany. It's not that they didn't, if you have a piece of German silver that says 800 on it, that's good. That's exactly as it should be for being made in Germany. And then France was so complicated, and how it's like wine. In my silver course, I talk about how it reminds me so much of wine, because they had different finenesses. They did they did sterling, but they also did 900. They did a lot of things, and their marks looked like insects and animals. And I mean, it's wonderfully fantastical and also kind of maddening when you're trying to figure out what this microscopic little thing hammered into the silver that maybe looks like a cricket, but maybe it looks like a grasshopper. And it's really, really important to know the difference. It can get very challenging.
That's actually one of the most, I think, surprising things I learned from you in your course was all the different markings of French silver. And some of the pictures you show, like it's a boar head and this geometric, like, I don't know how many sided parallelogram thing. And it was, how do you, I can't even imagine trying to figure out, like, is that the boar head, or is that, it does seem to be very mind boggling. So I'm so glad that you are able to do that. So speaking of like silver collections and different markings, so if I happen to have a silver collection I'm not ready to part with yet, which may sound familiar to much of our audience, what is the best way to store the pieces from those collections?
I love this question because I spend so much time trying to educate about this. So I love being able to proactively give people the tools to make better decisions so their silver stays happy. I've seen a lot of sad situations for storage. So I'll start with the ideal. I like the silver boxes for flatware. Most any silver box and I often, this is amusing to me, I often see silver boxes that are not the brand of the flatware service. It doesn't even matter. You can just, it doesn't need to all match, but having it be fitted with the wood box, and it has the fitted box that is lined and it keeps out the air, that's great for flatware. If you don't have one of those and you have storage, challenges, as many of us do, just the silver bags are great. And you can use those for hollowware as well as flatware. And those can be ordered online, pretty inexpensively. And so if you have a flatware service and a small bowl and then a big bowl and then a pitcher, you can select bags to purchase that fit what you need. And so that's a great way that you can really customize that, because really what we're trying to do is keep the silver surface from interacting with the air. And before I really went into the chemistry of it, I always assumed, oh, it's the oxygen in the air it's reacting with, but that's not true. It's the sulfur in the air. And so when tarnish forms, what happens is the sulfur in the air is interacting with the silver surface of the item, and it's creating silver sulfide, which is really hard to say. And then that's that tarnish that you see. So when you're polishing your silver to make it shiny again, you're actually removing a whole layer of your object. It's not that you're changing the surface so that the same surface is shiny again. You're just wiping off part of it, and then you're exposing a new fresh layer. It's like exfoliating your silver, basically. So it's really important to not do that a lot, because each time you do that, you're going to be removing part of your object, which is why sometimes if you inherit this Victorian silver with beautiful little decorations on it, sometimes it can be really faint because it was polished so much that it's worn down the original layer of the silver, and the design is fainter. So when you're not using the silver, if you keep it in a silver box, or if you keep it in silver bags, there's silver chests sometimes in dining rooms. So a lot of the fitted sideboards, they'll have an actual area where silver can go to keep it safe. That I've always, it looks like the silver that I've appraised in pieces of furniture like that has always been in really good shape. So those are my recommendations. And then I can, if you'd like, get into the please never do this. I don't want to hear about a sad situation if you do this types of storage.
I think you read my mind on the next question. I would love to know, what should we never do with our silver?
Okay, well, and I get there. I don't want anyone to feel any silver shame about this, because this is why people like me need to give talks like this, because it's hard to figure out if you don't know. But thinking of some things I've encountered through the years, never put saran wrap on silver, or put it in a plastic bag. I actually encounter this quite a lot, because it makes sense. You're trying to keep the air away, and you are, but the problem is plastic is not stable. And so the plastic can create its own chemical reaction and discolor the silver, and particularly the saran wrap. It was ugly. It was really, really sad. So never use saran wrap. I don't recommend plastic bags. Newspaper, sometimes silver, I encounter silver wrapped in newspaper. Don't do that, because the newspaper in general is not a good, Brooke would have a lot to say about newspaper, I think, from your previous talk, but newspaper is very acidic because it's made of wood pulp. And so it's going to really damage whatever is stored in it. And so don't use newspaper to wrap your silver, because that's not going to be good. And then rubber bands. Don't use rubber bands to, keep your forks together and your spoons together, because the rubber can cause a chemical reaction. I've actually seen a bundle of flatware where it carved out a channel in the handles and ate away at it. It was terrible. So those, yeah, and those, those are the biggies. But just really, if you get the appropriate silver bags and a fitted chest, if you have flatware, or a flatware bag, they have all the little slots. That's great. Done.
What about some of the common, I think you see on Facebook, like silver hacks? You can polish your silver using toothpaste, or like, what are some thoughts about, like, how should you properly polish and care for your silver?
I would not recommend doing any of those Facebook hacks. Really, dedicated professional silver polish would be my recommendation. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to attend a talk by Jeffrey Herman, who's a very well-regarded silver conservator, and I don't think he would be on board with the Facebook hacks, So you can do a lot of damage if you dip your silver. I know dipping silver is a thing, the foil, I've seen, the foil thing. Please don't do that, because the beautiful thing about silver is it's actually very stable if you just do what it wants to keep it happy. It's antimicrobial. It's been used for medical purposes for centuries, and which is also a great reason to have it be flatware, because it has those antibacterial properties. But as long as you just treat it how it wants to be treated. It will last forever, just kind of like the examples of the 5,000-year-old pieces.
Mhm. No, I think there's a whole series here on debunking silver myths that maybe you should start your own
That's a great
social media
idea.
campaign on. So when we first talked, Sarah, about kind of all things silver, you mentioned that you often help clients find creative solutions and ways to actually use their silver in their current day lives. What are some of your favorite outside the box uses for silver that you've seen or that you've come up with yourself?
Thank you. And I love doing this. This is something I do a lot for all different object types for clients where they've inherited a household of a loved one's things. And there's that awful, overwhelming moment where it's like, what am I going to do? I have a house, like I have things. Now I have a whole other house of things I need to deal with. And a lot of them have, I like to call objects memory grenades because they're, they look so innocent and then they blow up on you. They hold so much. And I feel like a lot of the work I do, it's both the literal, I write appraisal reports with market data, but there are all of those other deeper elements and kind of the emotional and psychological underpinnings that are very present. Sometimes they are the most present for the person I'm working with. And I think that it's important to acknowledge them. And I love to help people brainstorm creatively for how they can weave these objects into their life in a way that they can look at this piece and smile and think, oh, this was so and so's piece. And I it makes me happy to look at, and it can suit their lives. So, I mean, so many different examples come to mind that for people I've worked with where for example, there was a tea and coffee service where it didn't, there with the kids, it didn't make sense that just one of them got it. And so it was great. They all got different pieces of it and they used them as pencil cups on the desk because they were all, scholarly kids. And so it's like, there was the sugar bowl, somebody got the sugar bowl and they could use that on their desk, and somebody else got the creamer. And I love that because you don't need to keep things together. That leads to a lot of fighting in families where it's like, well, who's going to get this? We can't split it up. And I always say in these situations, I mean, yes, it may in fact impact the monetary value, but just split it up if that's what is going to keep the heart value and lead to a better outcome for the family. So I think that a lot of the things we assume we need to do, like, oh, if I keep this flatware service, I need to use it every day. No, you can use it when you have a dinner party, or you can have your ice cream with it. I mean, all of these things can be repurposed in how it suits you. I often like to ask my clients when they're in that like deer in the headlights, what do I do with all this stuff moment? What can you upgrade in your life? Like, yes, you may have all of your objects, but is there something you've had since college? Can you switch it out for this really nice thing that, your loved one had? And so sometimes people decide to use the sterling flatware as their everyday, silverware, which I love. It's that because it's actually really healthy to eat off of sterling. It's very non-toxic. So, that's a great solution for that. Or, people can, if you have a silver bowl and you may not want to eat off of it, but you like looking at it, put your mail in it. All of these things. I often think we shouldn't be so precious with our objects. I mean, yes, I love having things be in good condition. And it pains me when like I encounter the silverware with the huge channel from the rubber bands and things like that. But the objects should be used and loved. And so I'm always in support of helping people try to figure out what do they need to do to reach that outcome where there's something that they can use and love.
Mhm. I love that. I love that philosophy. It's, cherish the moments, the objects, the stories, the memories, and make new ones and pass them down. We've got a question from one of our audience members about if you're going to use silver in everyday eating or serving, are there any foods you should not have your silver come in contact with?
Great question. Salty foods. Salt and silver do not get along. And the example, for the analogy, it's like when you put the salt on the slugs in the garden. Well, please don't, because it's not nice to the slugs, but some people do. That's basically what happens to silver. So, and that's actually in historical antique silver salts. That's why you'll see that they always have a cobalt glass blue liner, and they needed to have that inset glass blue liner because otherwise, if you put salt in there with direct contact, it would eat away at the silver. So that is a great question. silver is wonderful for everyday use, but you do have to make sure that, like, if you're going to serve something very salty, just put a glass plate or another plate on top of it as a protective layer, and then you'll be fine.
Great to know. And I've got a question too. What about the dishwasher? How does silver, is that just a giant no-no, or what are your thoughts on silver in a dishwasher?
It's very controversial. This comes up a lot. And yes, if you have silver that you put in your dishwasher every day forever, it probably will lead to some, condition wear over time. But I often encounter clients where they say, well, the only way I'm going to use this is if I can put it in the dishwasher. And it's something they really clearly care about. So who am I to say, oh, well, you can't put it in the dishwasher? Where I fall, in my position, which is probably not where everybody in my field it falls, is I support people doing what they have to use the item and enjoy it. And if it involves damaging it, as long as they know they're damaging it and they consent to that, that's their business.
Great. That makes me feel a little bit less guilty after cleaning up after Thanksgiving and not knowing exactly what I should or should not do. Sarah, if you were looking to expand your collection or add to your own personal silver or gift silver to a loved one, where would you go to find pieces that you really love? Do you have any kind of favorite spots, or are you a big fan of, you mentioned earlier, estate sales or auctions? Kind of share some thoughts people are looking to, if our audience is looking to actually grow their collection of silver.
What a good question. This is going to differ for, all across the country or internationally. I know we've got some international artifactors, but generally speaking, there are quite a few sources of, places to source great silver nowadays. There are some really good Etsy sellers where they kind of curate what they find. There are silver dealers who are professional silver dealers. They have some really beautiful collections. And then just in terms of everyday items, I mean, estate sales usually have some really good silver at them. Auctions usually have silver in most general auctions and the nice thing is that you can just preview as well. Like you can use it to train your eye and think, what's my taste? Do I like this form? Do I like that form? Or, do I really like Edwardian silver, or is coin silver more my thing? And so you can see a lot of different forms and train your eye and figure out what you respond to. And so I find that there are online retailers too, like all the famous ones like Replacements, but it can be fun if you don't have a lot or you're looking to grow your collection, just to source it locally as well.
That's great. Thank you. We've got another question from our audience. Earlier, you were talking about the markings on different silver sets and sterling silver. Are the markings on tabletop ware and flatware any different than what you would find on jewelry?
Ooh, I like that. Yes. And I will add the caveat that I don't appraise jewelry. I like jewelry, but I'm not a jewelry expert. So my answer is with the framework that I am not a professional jewelry appraiser, but there's both the space issue. There's not very much space to mark things on jewelry. So by just that alone, the markings are going to be very, very concentrated. And hollowware generally has much bigger and more extensive markings than flatware does. Often on flatware, if you're lucky, you'll have the maker's name and sterling. Sometimes it's just sterling. Sometimes it's a tiny, very, very hard to read, hammered in pictorial mark. If you're really, really lucky, like Gorham is great about this. Whenever I come across a Gorham, it's like, oh, thank you, Gorham. They'll say, Gorham, sterling, here's the name of the pattern. Here was the year it was patented. The whole back of the handle is just full of all that information, really easy to read. But this rarely happens. And then British silver, I haven't really even gotten into British silver. British silver is a whole different animal. And once you know how to read it, it's really fun, but it's tricky initially because you think, what am I looking at? What does this mean? And each symbol, if you can read it, which it's tiny usually, so it's hard to read, it corresponds to a known piece of data. So you can piece it together that way. It's like the Rosetta Code kind of.
It does sound like decoding silver is a lot like trying to put together pieces of a new language, or at least for myself, who again is an untrained. I love looking at silver, love using the pieces for my mother. But I don't, again, not a silver expert. So one question I do have is thinking about the future, like how you mentioned earlier in the talk about how silver evolved to be kind of a tabletop item that denoted either wealth or for entertaining, and how it's evolved over time. Where do you see the future of silver and tabletop ware especially? Like, what do you, 100 years from now, what do you think people are going to be doing with their silver? Or what do you wish they will be doing with their silver?
Well, clearly, I wish they'll be using it, but I love this question because there's what I think it's intriguing. I mean, depending on how optimistic I feel about humanity, that varies by the minute. But what I would love to see happen is a shift in the culture where people realize, they grow tired of the disposable nature of our culture, where everything's takeout or it's styrofoam, it's going to be in a landfill forever, and there's just I would hope that there would be an increasing hunger for things that are real, things that are solid, things that have a heritage, and that you can build meaning and memory with. And so particularly over the last few years, when we've by necessity been so isolated, I think it has prompted a hunger for more community and literally coming together in people. And so it would be lovely if 100 years from now people were actually using the silver for its original purpose, to be in community together and enjoy good food and just enjoy having things around them that are quality and solid and last 100 years. I mean, so many of the things in our life now, they'll last 3 years and then they break. And so I really respect the enduring nature of silver.
Mhm. That's great. Thank you so much. We've got another question from one of our audience members. They would like to know that earlier you mentioned how some pieces are in the museum. What would make a piece of silver from one of our collections museum worthy?
Ooh, well, I can't speak for the museums, but generally, from my observations, a lot of the silver in museums is made by a very famous maker that represents kind of the collection story that they're trying to tell and the mission of their collection. Or it might be a maker with a very strong tie to the region where the museum is. So that's part of their interpretive history. Most museums have a guiding mission statement, and then the collection is sort of it, built or maintained in light of that mission statement. And so it may be that it's an exceptional piece, and it doesn't matter that the person who made it was 6,000 miles away, or it could be that a very important donor donated the piece, and it doesn't matter how great the piece is because it's about the donor. I mean, there's so many museums can be quite political, so I won't wade into that. But it's if you have a piece that has a strong local tie to a particular region where there is a museum, and you don't want the piece, all the local historical societies are going to come kill me for saying this, but it's worth at least reaching out to them to see, is that something they have interest in? I know that a lot of them are very beleaguered at the moment, so they may not have the capacity to accept something like that. But particularly for people where they really don't want to keep it, but they want it to be in a responsible place, it never hurts to ask.
Mhm. And that's actually one of the things, I mean, I think it's very interesting you say that, because that was one of the things that 2 weeks ago Brooke Lake mentioned in her talk about curating and preserving like family historical mementos and memorabilia, is that sometimes if you kind of get down to the end, you're the last part of the family keeper, you have this piece, you don't know what to do with it, like reach out to that local historical society. You may be surprised that there is, a place for it that can tell not just your family history, but also the history of the region over time. So I think that's a great suggestion. We've got a couple more questions from the audience. One is, what if I have silver items that I don't care about? Are there places that can take stuff that's meaningless to me and melt it down and remake it to something unique?
Oh, is it for them to use in their, so it's something unique for the
I would,
person asking the
I
question?
would think so, yes.
Yes, there are a lot of jewelers that do that, and where they can work with you to, create a design that's exactly what you want. And so that definitely is something that if it's, if you have other family members, you might want to check with them before you do that, just to keep the peace. But, if no one wants it, and it can be, literally through alchemy transformed into something that will have meaning, pretty much your local jeweler can help you with that.
Okay, that's great to know. Another question is, what is the most unique piece of silver you've ever seen or worked with?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's really hard to answer because I'm thinking, oh, there's this and there's this and there's this. I think there's unique, and then there's what I find really meaningful in terms of just, the heart value for people. So I personally really enjoy when I encounter baby cups and baby services in client assignments, and then the client can say, "Oh, this was so and so, and this was so and so." It's especially fun when it's various people in the lineage, and you can see like the tooth marks, and they must have banged it around, and so just literally for someone who's long since left this earth, but to have that artifact, I didn't do that on purpose, that was totally unintentional, that artifact of the babyhood of somebody who is not here anymore, but still has so much meaning for the person I'm standing next to. I find that to be a kind of magic. So sometimes it's the most mundane object that can be the most powerful. And in terms of unique, it's in client collections for really dedicated silver collectors. I've had the privilege of getting to see some really cool pieces. So
Mhm.
I don't want to divulge the private nature of some of these things, but I have so much respect for the silver collectors who just really do it out of the passion for the
Mhm.
genre. And they watch and they wait and they save things from being melted. I've had a lot of clients say, I saw that this smelter was going to buy it, and so I jumped in and bought it. I wasn't planning on buying it, but I had to save it, because it's just such a beautiful piece. And so I always love hearing that, because it's a good thing that I don't do that, because that would be very expensive for me, but I like that other people do it.
I'm gonna say, I bet my husband's probably very happy that I don't do that either. It sounds like a very expensive hobby. Speaking of like kind of, you mentioned that people may jump in and if they see a smelter is going to purchase an item to melt down, they may purchase it instead. What are some of your favorite resources if you're thinking about like either viewing different collections and seeing what's out there, or just, kind of what do you enjoy reading about silver or looking at about silver?
For people who really want to train their eye at a very high level, the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection, which it's in the links for the two pieces that you shared, they have a fantastic collection. And I actually sourced a lot of the images for my silver course from them, because they have an open access program for certain objects. And so I was able to use items that they had made in the public domain. But they have a really phenomenal silver collection. Looking at auction house catalogs, particularly for dedicated silver sales, is a great way to train your eye and just see a lot of silver. And then for the really kind of top tier silver, two of the dealers in America where I like to really study their catalog and their inventory, and this is also great for comparables in my research for insurance, are Spencer Marks and Shrubsole. And those are, those are the high end dealers, but they have really beautiful items. So just to kind of see what the medium can do, it's
Mhm.
really inspiring.
That's great. We've got a couple more questions from our audience. One is, why do we find silver in products like detergent, antimicrobial clothing, etc.?
Oh, good question. Precisely because of these inherent qualities for silver. Like it's an antimicrobial clothing, because it is like, that's the reason it is antimicrobial clothing, that the silver is woven in, because it has that inherent property in its chemical makeup. And silver is used in so many items in the modern day. It's kind of dreadfully ironic, because people have all this, 100-year-old silver. They're like, oh, what do I do with this? I don't need this. But then your electronics have a lot of silver in them, because silver is, has a frequency, traits for conducting electricity. So it's used in cameras, it's used in a lot of electronics. And so it's actually a huge part of our everyday life, but in ways that we don't know about or we don't explicitly see.
Mhm. Thank you so much for detailing that. I've gotten another couple of questions here. I'm going to put them together because I think they go together. Can people at home craft with silver? Is it easy to work with? And where do you buy raw silver to work with?
Oh, these are really good questions. Some years ago, I actually took a metalworking class because as you probably could tell from my introduction, I like doing a lot of creative things, but I was hoping it would deepen my tactile understanding of silver. I didn't intend on becoming a metal worker, but I thought that I'll get by this kind of experiential learning, I'll have a better understanding of the pieces that I work with to appraise. And boy, was it hard. So I do not consider myself someone who has any knowledge or training for that, but I never got past copper. It was, but the teacher demonstrated, and I personally found it very, it takes a great deal of skill, and there's so much involved with the temperature and the ductile qualities of the material, and how when you hammer it, what happens to it. And so if you've ever, I think on YouTube, there are a lot of videos of silversmiths working, and it's just fascinating to see how they do that. And I have a lot of respect for those skills. In terms of where to buy it, I'm not sure, actually. I would ask your local jeweler, because I think they probably would be better informed about locally wherever someone is, how to obtain that.
That's great. Thank you so much. We got another question from the audience. What is the oldest silver piece you've come across? And before you answer, I'll just say on Artifacts, we've got a couple of old silver coins from the 1600s. I will grab those links and pop them in the chat so people can see while you answer, what's the oldest silver piece you've come across?
Oh, that's a good question. Personally, that I've held in my hands, it was a spoon from the 1600s that I had the opportunity to work with. And I loved that spoon. It was so cool. It had a different center of gravity than we think of spoons now. Spoons from that century were designed very differently. I mean, it was actually not that, the forks were or fairly recent on the scene at that point in time. And so it was so elegant. Like I think it would be fun if a flatware maker introduced a line of a flatware that was based on ancient designs, because it would just be wonderful to kind of have that sense of time travel and holding these items in your hands. So yeah, I love that spoon. That was really fun to work with.
Not many people can say they've held a spoon from the 1600s in their hands. That's, I think, a very unique find there. We've got another question. Do you find lots of real silver coins? And are their countries still minting in silver?
Ooh, good questions. I am not a coin expert, so I probably don't really have the competency to answer that, but there are lots of silver coins out there. And generally when I get inquiries for appraisals for coins, I direct people to my colleagues who are experts in that. But yes, there are a lot of silver coins out there. And silver is definitely still being mined today because it has so much use in modern culture and modern electronics. So yeah, and that probably the conditions of that may not always be the greatest working conditions I can imagine, but the history of precious metal mining through time is really closely linked with all the history really of human development.
Well, thank you, Sarah. With that, are there any other questions from the audience before we close out our evenings with artifacts with Sarah Rita? No? All right. I'm popping in one last link to another one of the artifacts that we have that is silver. Oh, we have another question. Sorry, sir, before we close down. Is there a country that has the most interesting pieces of work with silver? Like Peru, East Asia? You had mentioned earlier, I'm adding this part now. You mentioned earlier Russia and Britain and France. But is there a specific country that has the most interesting pieces of work with silver?
I'm trying to figure out how to answer this diplomatically without,
We are in
insulting one
DC,
country or another. Yeah, I think they're all interesting, of course, but recently I had the opportunity to answer a question on an appraiser forum about markings on a piece of silver that was made in Egypt. And I've actually never personally encountered silver made in Egypt before. So I went on the deep dive for the research for the markings to answer this colleague's questions. And I loved the charm of the marks. Like one of the marks on that Egyptian silver had was a cat, so it's literally this beautiful cat. And then it was replaced in 1946 with a lotus. And, so there were all these just incredibly beautiful marks. And I thought, this is so cool. So is that diplomatic enough? They're all wonderful. I like them all, but I recently had the chance to research a piece made in Egypt and was really charmed by how beautiful the marks were.
That sounds gorgeous. And what an experience. Well, Sarah, I was going to say a really big thank you tonight for joining us. I know I have learned a ton talking with you and also taking your silver course online. I hope the audience tonight has enjoyed hearing you speak about all the different ins and outs in silver, your tips of what to do, what not to do. We will definitely be including those tips when we send out the recap of tonight in the recording as well. Oh, I think we've got one more question, and I think we've got time. If that's okay with you?
Of course.
Question is, why is Mexican silver so sought after?
Mexico has a lot of silver mines, and so it was still is a huge source of silver. In terms of Mexican silver, silver by William Spratling is particularly popular, and his designs became extremely popular. And so for that, it's really the association with his name and his designs. But Mexican silver, I really enjoy when I praise it because it's so, beefy, like because there was such an abundance of silver there, they were really generous with it, where in some other countries they may be a little more sparing because they really had to make it go a long way. Even the trays usually in tea and coffee services that were made in Mexico, often I encounter them and they're sterling and they're this huge massive tray. So and they have really again really beautiful thick creamy feeling in your hand.
Great to know. Thank you. Well, with that, we will say good night to everyone. Thank you again, Sarah, for joining us. Once again, Sarah Reeder, CEO of Artifactual History. The recording of the session will be live on our YouTube channel tomorrow morning. And we wish everyone a good night. And if you're joining us next week with Evenings for Artifacts, we're going to have a conversation with 4 of our Artifacts community members as they story share about some of their favorite artifacts. So think of it as a show and tell or a story show and tell to get us all talking and thinking about some of our cherished items as we head into the holidays. So once again, thank you so much, Sarah, and good night, everyone. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Heather.